Hi, class, and welcome back to Intro to Psych. Today we're going to cover Chapter 9, Motivation. And to talk about motivation, we're going to start off with this big picture question. What is motivation, and why do people do what they do? So, there's plenty of reasons we're motivated to do things. Maybe because we're hungry, because we're in love, because we want a family, because we want money. I don't know, even things like jealousy are reasons that we are motivated. But what is motivation? Well, motivation is some kind of mental, energetic force. It's an energized, directed, and sustained force that motivates or moves us to do things, to behave, to think, to feel, to change the way we do this. And plenty of things affect when we will choose to initiate our motivations, how we will direct our motivations, how intense our motivations will feel, if we will persist on our motivations. Right? But generally, motivation is just this urge or desire to move towards one goal and accomplish some tasks. Many of you have been in the situation where your motivations kind of wax and wane. Sometimes they're more strong, sometimes they're weaker. But when it comes to motivations, they can't actually be observed. We can only ask you why you maybe did something, and you might not even know. So we could be motivated due to biological reasons, emotional reasons, cognitive reasons, or even social reasons like peer pressure. But all of these are reasons why we might be motivated to do one thing or another. And to give you some kind of quick example questions here, imagine that you are going to try a new haircut because you saw it in all the fashion magazines. Well, why would you have been motivated to do that? Well, due to social reasons. If you put on a jacket because it's cold, you're probably motivated due to biological reasons. If you drop a course because you think in your mind, you go, I'm just not smart enough to take this class, I'm just too stupid, that is going to be a motivation relying on your expectancies, your beliefs, your cognitions. And finally, if you offer to tutor somebody sitting next to you, that's not necessarily going to be a biological motivation if you want to be funny, but I would argue that that is a emotional motivation, because it is coming from the liking of this person. So that's our kind of what motivation is. But now let's talk about 5 different theories on why we are motivated to do what we do. Now, it's important to note that none of these theories fully explain why we do things. They all kind of help us to explain in certain contexts or in certain specific instances why we might engage in a behavior. So don't think that all of these are going to be relevant in every scenario. But the most broad one I like to start off is the evolutionary model, right? The idea that we are motivated due to our involuntary, unlearned genetic responses that we would call instincts. And the goal here is just to enhance our survival, right? So, you didn't have to learn that a spider was scary, but the whole point here is to know that spiders are scary, so stay away, and then to do what I've already done, pass on your genes. This also helps explain, alongside another motivational theory in a couple minutes, why somebody might get married to an individual who doesn't necessarily match with them in terms of like attractiveness, for instance, right? Because maybe this enhances our survival abilities. And so I'm going to ask you a couple very strange and maybe somewhat upsetting questions, but this helps us to dig into why the evolutionary theory is the way it is. Imagine that you're on a boat that overturns, and you've got a 5-year-old kid and a 1-year-old kid. They're both male or female, whichever you prefer. The idea here is that the boat is sinking, and you can only save one, and one is going to die. None of that funny business that, oh, they can get a life jacket, whatever. Who do you choose to save if you can only save one of your kids? Most people will say the 5-year-old. And why? They'll argue that, well, the 5-year-old has a better chance of surviving whatever happens after the crash. On the other hand, this is a weirder question now. Imagine it's same scenario, but your kids are now 40 years old and 20 years old. I don't know, you're like 60 and in perfect health, I guess. And you can save one of your adult children here. Same gender for them. Who do you choose to save? Well, most people will, instead of going with the 40-year-old, will say the 20-year-old. And it's the same logic. Well, because they've got more, right? They're probably more capable of doing things. And so, that kind of leads to one of my own. Imagine that you're on a boat that overturns, but this time it's a random 30-year-old dude and your pet, dog or cat. Who do you choose to save? Most people say they're pets, and they let me die, right? Rip in peace me. But the idea here is that for us, our pets are like family. I mean, it's not necessarily evolution, but this helps explain that. Another real one that is interesting, not quite as funny as that one, is that imagine that you and your significant other have a child, right? So when my wife and I had a child, it turns out that on the average, one mom is nicer to the baby than the other mom. Who is it? It's actually, on average, the wife's mom, the mother's mom. Why? Well, think genetically. There's a 100% chance that that's my wife's kid. I mean, have you seen that child? It looks dead on like me. But, right, you could argue that maybe that's not really my kid. And so grandma would be a little wary about, like, I don't want somebody else's kid here. So that's the evolutionary model, this idea that we're trying to survive, pass on our genes, and that keeps us motivated. The second motivational model we'll talk about here is the drive reduction model. And the drive reduction model has a couple terms that people seem to get confused, but it's a really easy idea. It's the idea that our body is a lot like Goldilocks in the sense that we don't want it not too hot, not too cold, not too soft, not too hard, not too full, not too empty of a stomach. Right? We maintain a psychological equilibrium, a homeostatic level. And what happens when our body falls out of homeostasis? Well, that's a need. We feel a need. So when my body physically sends signals, physical signals that says, hey, your stomach is growling and you need to eat soon. That is a need. My body is telling me, you need food. So what happens is mentally, my brain has to now engage my body to go do something. So I have a psychological drive, a mental drive that provides motivation. So to me, the other way you can think about this, right, is that if you have a need, you have you have a need to go get McDonald's, right? My daughter screaming at me says, I want McDonald's. She doesn't, but imagine, right? You have to go drive there, right, to get that thing. And that is going to be what is changing your behavior. That is going to be the motivator, is the driver. So what is driving my body to get up out of my chair and go get food, right? That is going to do this here. So you can imagine that the unbalanced equilibrium is going to be a lot more of the physical sense, right? The physical need of water, my mouth being dried out. And that is going to make me mentally feel thirsty. And that mental drive, that feeling of thirstiness, is really our motivation. And so when we complete that drive, we feel good, right? We're better. And now we're back to normal. So again, right, these physiological needs are going to cause our psychological drives. And those psychological drives are really our motivators. Next up, we have the optimal arousal model, or you may also hear this called the Yerkes-Dodson law. Basically, the idea behind this is that everybody thrives under a specific amount of pressure, and once you pass that pressure point, things start going wrong. So we all have a level of arousal. So we are talking again in terms of the parasympathetic nervous system, this fight or flight response. If you are taking an exam, you want to take that exam not when you have just woken up, right? Because you are so sleepy, you don't know what's going on. You also don't want to take that exam if you've been running across campus and you woke up, 30 minutes ago freaked out, because you're going to be too stressed. The idea is that a certain level of stress, a certain level of arousal, of activation is going to get you in the mode to do well on something. And so we are all individually based in this. Some of us are require higher arousal. Some of us require lower arousal because, this helps explain why some people will do things like go skydiving. What's the motivation to jump out of an airplane? To increase my peak level of arousal, right? Why do people ride roller coasters? Because it's fun, because that helps to bring up that psychological arousal. So another reason another discussion of motivation, model of motivation we can talk about is how we are best motivated at a certain level of motivation. From there, we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And most people by the end of this lecture really feel that this is a good way to look at our needs in the way that we can kind of understand ourselves. So I think this is a really useful thing. And so Maslow's hierarchy of needs is going to argue that we have 5 levels of needs here, starting at the physiological needs, moving up to safety, love and belongingness, esteem, and self-actualization. And the idea is, for lack of a better example, if you've ever played The Sims, you'll know that your character has these little bars for like hunger, if they have to go potty, energy, social, hygiene, fun. This is a lot like what Maslow's hierarchy of needs is. And the idea is that if any of these bars get too low, right, if we run out of physiological needs, right, we are all of a sudden starving, right? Or, we haven't slept in 30 hours, or, we are out of water for the last day. We don't care about many other things other than our physiological needs, right? We have to focus on meeting this first level of needs before we can worry about other things, right? I don't necessarily care as much whether people are my friends if it's been 2 days since I've eaten. I'm starving, just get me some food, right? And so once we meet our physiological needs, once we've finally gotten some food into us, now we can start worrying about things like safety. And safety includes a lot of things, not just physical safety. Employment, right? Because that's a part of your control of your life, the ability to have a safe and, good life in this case. So imagine that you have all your physiological needs met. You have your safety needs met, right? You live in a good house, you have a good family, right? You're fed, you have water, things are going well. Now you're able to start worrying about your love and belonging. Am I, right, socially, having friends? Once you gain enough love and belonging needs, you can focus on needs like self-esteem, confidence, belief in yourself. And once you have self-esteem, you feel loved and belong, you are safe, you are physiologically there, then you can start working on self-actualization. And self-actualization, I'm going to be honest, is something that most of us will never achieve. Maslow himself only said he could call 12 people in the world that he recognized who were self-actualized. I'd argue somebody like Mr. Rogers was self-actualized because they were a person who just did the best that they could as who they were. It's very much related to, if you remember back in high school English, Walt Whitman and transcendentalism and becoming the best version of you. And this is actually going to come up again with Maslow when we talk about him in personality and the humanistic theories, like how we can be good humans and good people. But that's something for ahead of the time. So to give you an example of a question you might see, imagine that Natalie's a single mom and she wants to send her daughter to private school. So she meets a rich man who wants to marry her. She doesn't love him, but she says, "I will marry you." Why would she choose to marry him? What need is that satisfying based on Maslow? Well, here you'd have to argue that she's marrying him not just for herself, but her daughter, and that is a part of a safety need. Similarly, another question for you, in high school, there's a great desire to make friends and be part of a group, and according to Maslow, you'd argue that teenagers are probably focused on, for the most part, their love and belonging level, this idea of feeling like they belong. Next up is self-determination theory, our final theory here. Self-determination theory argues that we are determined by 3 basic needs. The first need is the need of autonomy, the need to have some control in our life. And as young kids, we have very little control over our lives. And so one thing that our parents can do to help us as a young child gain a sense of autonomy is give children small levels of autonomy. I'm not giving my daughter the keys to my car and saying, go pick up dinner, but I am saying, what do you want to do this evening? What do you want to eat? What outfit should we choose today? Right? So engaging in that sense of autonomy. Competence, which is strongly related to self-efficacy, this idea that if I go to try to do this, I can do what I think I can do. I'm efficacious. I'm able to accomplish my abilities. Finally, relatedness. So this desire to engage in warm relations with others, social belongingness. You've seen this come up, right, with Maslow even. This idea that it's important to be close with one another. So again, we've got 5 major theories to help explain motivation and give us some understanding as to why people do what they do. But from there, we also have to bring up some more motivation in everyday life. So, yeah, we talked about some theories on motivation, but let's talk about our motivations and where they come from. The question is, why do you do what you do? Right? So, if you're in a sport, if you are playing an instrument, if you are in school, why are you doing that? Are you doing it because you want to? Right? Is this coming from an internal place? Right? I think about Ash Ketchum. Why did he want to go and be the very best? Because he just did. Right? So why are you in college? Do you enjoy it? Or are you in college maybe because you know that it's going to get you a job, that it's going to have some kind of external reward or praise? And let's be honest, most things in our life are not exactly one or the other. I love teaching, right? I do teaching because I enjoy it. But I'm not going to teach if there's no money involved, right? I need to pay my bills. So, right, recognizing that intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards might play a role in the same task that we're doing. Right? Some people might play sports because mom and dad told them to, or play an instrument because mom and dad told them to. Some of us might play an instrument because we wanted to. Sometimes that changes over time. It goes from intrinsic to extrinsic. But you can see these intrinsic motivations are coming from internal reasons, extrinsic motivations, external reasons. Beyond that, we can also talk about this need to affiliate or need to belong. We know that the need to belong is a fundamental human need. And when we don't belong, when we feel physiological and psychological ostracism, we'll call it, you have a lot of problems. It's the equivalent of smoking 1 or 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Being lonely is. There's an increased risk of suicide as well, right? So it's important, as human beings we are meant to be grouped together. We are meant to have social connections, and it's very, very bad. You can imagine things like, and there it completely goes from my mind, solitary confinement as a really negative thing. The final type of motivation seems a little weird, but to me, it's one of the coolest. We don't stop. Humans don't stop. We have a need to keep going. If you decide that you want to lay in bed all day, this is a problem, right? Everybody wants to lay in bed one day every once in a while, but if you are consistently saying, I just want to lay in bed, that's outside the norm. We have a desire to do things well and to overcome obstacles. Just as human beings, right? We just see something, we say, can we do that? And now it's important to note that this is based on your current standings and your current goals, right? For some of us, that motivation, it's certainly not for me, is being the fastest athlete in the world and gaining a gold medal. Other people, it's simply recovering after a surgery and being able to walk again. But both of those are achievements that people are still pushing towards, even in that same domain. When it comes to motivation, we can also talk about not doing what we maybe want to, right? So sometimes our motivations are competing. Maybe we have a motivation to send a text to an ex, and we also have the motivation to keep things civil, right? And so a really cool study looking at this asked young children to come into the lab a little bit hungry, and they set a marshmallow down in front of them on the table, and they said, I'm going to be gone for a couple minutes. If you don't touch that marshmallow, when I come back, I'll give you another marshmallow. And so one thing is seeing if children are able to regulate their behavior, their emotions. And it turns out that if children are able to not think about this marshmallow, they're able to do better at this. But this is all related to what I call implementation intentions. And I think this is a really important thing because this helps us to know how to do better next time. So an implementation intention is an intention to implement a behavior in the future. So this is related to my research on counterfactual thinking, or these if-only thoughts, right? So imagine that you failed your exam. Oh, if only I would have studied, I would have done better. Certainly that's one thing you can think of, but does that really help you to actually implement that? Well, maybe we could do something different, right? If I study each chapter on a specific day before the exam, then I'll avoid failing. That's so much better than just being like, I should study. Right? And so recognizing how that helps us to motivate ourselves as well. And this is something kind of more discussed in later classes as well. The second half of this section of class is going to kind of make a hard left turn. And here we're going to talk about emotions. And so usually in class, I have people get together and ask a few questions, but just think about these yourselves. What are emotions and what aren't emotions, right? We know like happy and sad are emotions, but is hungry an emotion? Is hangry an emotion? And do you think there's gender differences in emotions? Do you think men or women experience emotions more or less than one another? So, right, you can think about that, but to continue on, let's describe some of these things. All right, so when we talk about emotions as human beings, we are not talking about emotions as psychologists. Those are different things. When we're talking about emotions as human beings, we're typically talking about what is known as affect, not affect, but affect. Affect is the broadest category of emotional phenomenon. This is any type of emotion you have, right? So happy, sad, angry, weird, awkward, things like that are going to fall in this. This is just the feelings you have. We can break it down into two types though. We can talk about mood. Mood is going to be something that is probably better actually explained after emotions. So let's start with emotions. Emotions are going to be specific, short times lasting for maybe 1 to 5 minutes, and they are going to change the way we think, feel, and act in the moment. So, right, you see a cute little doggy, and you have a very quick emotion, a happy emotion, go, puppy, right? Like, this is something that is going to be very short-lived. Now, compare that to a mood, on the other hand. A mood is going to operate in the background of this. So, right, when you are quote unquote in a bad mood, when you wake up on the wrong side of the bed, right, and you're like, I don't know why I'm feeling grumpy today, that's a mood. It's not about a specific thing. It lasts a longer time, but, right, it still is affecting you. So one way to think about this is, right, on my wedding day, I had a very good mood all day my wedding day, right? Throughout the whole day, it was a good day. Right, a lot of times during that day, I had intense positive emotions, right? The moment I said I do, right? That was a extremely positive emotion there. But that goes along with the mood, right? I wasn't beaming that way the whole day. So hopefully that makes sense, but also this is going to all be underlined with something else, this idea of emotional appraisals. So appraising something is determining its value or its worth. And so we can determine the value or worth of our emotions and see what they feel. This is how you can go on a roller coaster, and some people will think it's a fearful thing, right? Oh my gosh, I'm going to die. And some people will sit there and go, hey, this is pretty fun, right? So arguing that these are two different or two different ways to see the same event here. Okay, cool. Why do we have emotions then? Well, this is something that even the emotion researchers are still out on. But we'd argue that emotions are very useful because they show us what is important, what do we need to focus on, right? So they help us to interpret our surrounding circumstances. We see a baby crying, we focus on that and go, why are they crying? It enables us to respond effectively, right? So imagine that somebody cuts you off in traffic. Maybe if you're anything like me, right, you feel this very intensely, but you're able to modify this and, right, not freak out on a human being here. And so the idea, though, is if somebody was coming at me, right, trying to attack me, maybe that emotional response of anger could be useful in a certain circumstance here. Sure. All right. So maybe emotions are helping us to make sense of our world and do the things we need to focus on, right? Like pain, you could imagine as a emotion slash sense is helping us to know what to do. Now, I always like to tell people that in graduate school, I took a class on emotions with an emotion researcher, and I walked out of that class with more questions than I started with. So let's define emotions in these kind of specific hallmarks of what makes an emotion an emotion. And to start off with that, we're going to talk about how emotions are temporary, how they have different dimensions, how they can change our perceptions and our thought processes, and they can guide our actions. So going through this one at a time, emotions are temporary in the sense that they have a beginning and an end. Right before I did my doctorate defense presentation, I took a picture, right? This was the last picture before I had my doctorate. You could tell I was really excited here. And at the end, right, looked a lot better here. Now, am I still extremely happy because I graduated 5+ years ago? No, of course. Emotions go away over time. right? They fade. And it's important to note that emotions are multidimensional as well. So we all know one dimension of emotions. We usually talk about this as valence. We know emotions can be positive, can be negative. So, of course, there's positive and negative emotions, but you can also feel things like mixed feelings, right? There are reasons that you might feel both positive and negative. Usually, I think about this as like nostalgia, missing the old times and thinking about how great they were. So, that's that valence dimension, but we also have another dimension we're going to talk about, and that's arousal. So, again, we are talking about physiological arousal, not sexual arousal. It's the idea of how much energy you're feeling here, kind of low arousal on this guy and high arousal on the dude who's literally shaking. And so what happens here is you can plot these emotions as a kind of XY grid here, kind of like your classic planes that you would see in math. And so you can think about intense versus mild emotions, right? I can be happy or content, maybe relaxed, at ease, but that's not nearly as kind of intense as feeling excited or astonished or jovial. And so you can also think on this pleasant to unpleasant dimension, happy to sad. But right, taking this helps us to better explain why, right, when we look at the word happy, right, there's a ton of different types of happiness and how they might differ on valence and arousal here. The third factor we talk about is that emotions actually change the way we perceive things. And so a really cool study took place 2 months after our 9/11 attacks happened. And at this point, people were incredibly afraid that there might be another terrorist attack. And so we asked people to write about how the attacks made them either angry or scared. So write about how you were feeling angry or scared after these terrorist attacks. Then, after we had them write about that, we asked them one question. How likely do you think that there's going to be another terrorist attack on the US in the future? Turns out, feeling afraid makes you more likely to think that a terrorist attack is going to happen in the future. Why? Because if you are afraid, you are perceiving that something bad is going to happen. You're on the lookout for something bad to happen. Another study looking at perception had a similar kind of setup. They asked individuals to write about an event that made them one of a couple emotions. And the one we care about here is anger. So what we did was we made some people neutral, disgusted, sad, and another group angry. And then we had them play this really interesting quote unquote game. And the goal of this game was it's called the police officer's dilemma. And the idea is that you are going to see some people in front of you, and you have half a second to determine if the guy in front of you was holding a gun or was holding like a phone or a wallet or something. And this is kind of the same thing as what a police officer has to do, right? And so what we did was we measured how many mistakes you made. How many times you didn't shoot the guy with the gun, or how many times you shot the guy with the wallet here. And what we found, and what we care about here, is that you'll notice the one condition where there's a lot of difference is the angry condition. When you were angry, you were more likely to identify the wallet as a gun. Why? Because you perceive that as a threat. However, you don't flip it back the other way. You don't actually not shoot the gun trials more. You are fine. You actually do better than any other group in accurately predicting the guns. So what this is saying is that when you're in an angry mindset, you are more likely to focus on other angry things and be in that angry mode here. So that's something to keep in mind. Because like the way I think about this is if, you bump into somebody on the side of the road, or, when you're walking down the street and you're already in a bad mood, you're probably going to look at that person and be like, wow, I can't believe they did that on purpose. Versus if I bumped into you, on accident and you freak out at me, I'm like, I didn't mean it. That kind of thinking. The next one we talk about is how our emotions change the way we think about things. Our emotions shift the way we construe the world, you might call it here. And really the way we want to think about this is that in terms of positive emotions, when we are in a good mood, we are actually thinking in a broader and more kind of open mindset. And right, you want to think about this as like compared to a depressed individual who is going to want to sit inside, not do anything. A person who is in a positive mood is going to want to go out, make friends, try new things, explore, do things like that. A really interesting study brings people into the lab and asks them to be in a good or bad mood, and then asks them, how many uses can you think up for a brick? What? And it turns out that if you're in a positive mood, you are more likely to think up unique ways that you can use a brick. Of course, we can use a brick to build a house. Everybody thinks of that. But, you can use a brick as a weapon. You could use a brick as a doorstop. You could use a brick for just about, as a step stool to stand up on something, I guess, if you need that much extra space. Another kind of really strange cognitive experiment here asked people to look at these three squares at the top and then said, which of the bottom two shapes is the most similar to the top shape? People in a positive mood are more likely to choose the three triangles as being similar to the top shape. People in a less positive mood tend to say that the squares are more similar. I don't know. I find this one interesting. Not sure why this kind of works that way. But again, you would argue that it's the broaden and build. They're saying, well, the shapes are the same. The shapes, the bigger shape, the whole shape is the same. The triangles versus the squares. If you're not watching this and you're only listening, God help you, because this is going to look real confusing. Moving on from there, emotions do guide our actions. They give us an action tendency, an urge to carry out our behaviors, right? A motivator here. And they make us do things. They can make us either approach or avoid things. And so when we talked about that broaden and build hypothesis, we're kind of coming right back to that. This idea that negative emotions facilitate avoiding things. Positive emotions facilitate approaching things, right? So if we see a bull running at us, we have an avoidance motivation. I'm afraid. I need to get away. If we see $1,000, falling from the sky, I have a positive, approach motivation. I need to go get that here. So that helps us to understand what an emotion is, right? They're temporary, they have different dimensions, they change the way we see the world, they change the way we think, and they change the way we behave. Not only that, right, they help us to interpret our world and see what we should do, and then, respond specifically to the ways that we should in order to survive. Now let's quickly talk about what the elements of an emotion are. So there's three elements of an emotion. The one we're going to spend the most time on is this kind of behavior of emotion. But of our three elements here, we have the physiological sense of emotion, right? Your body does physiological things when you feel an emotion. When you're afraid, your heart starts pounding. We have an expression, right? The way that you choose to express this emotion. Do you laugh? Do you send a text that says, oh my God, that was the funniest thing I've ever seen, ha 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 ha, when you actually don't feel that way, right? And then this idea of subjective experience, or the ways that we choose to label an emotion. Kind of going back to that idea of, is this roller coaster scary or is this roller coaster fun? So the physiology of emotion, the physiological kind of basis for emotions, is the limbic system and the amygdala. Now, I'm not getting into this in a lot of detail, right? But what is happening here is that we are able to learn, recognize, and perceive emotions. And if we damage our amygdala, we have trouble reading and appraising other emotions, right? This is where you wouldn't be able to tell what somebody's feeling here. So physiologically, we have a center in the brain that is processing and perceiving all of our emotions. And it also happens to be right next to our hippocampus, which is going to be related to memory. So that's really all we have to say about the physiology of emotion. But in terms of the emotional expression here, right, that's what I'm more interested in, right? It's the fact that, if I showed you these 6 people, you would be able to tell me what emotions they have, even though they're from different parts of the world. They're different types of people, right? They're different races, different genders. And it's not just even that, it's the fact that nowadays I can send you a picture and you would know what I meant. And all of these actually line up to these other people's emotions here, right? The fact of the matter is emotional expression is so important to humans that when we can't see each other, we still try to express how we feel because we don't want to cause any problems. We want to keep things going well. And it's important to note that emotional expressions, the idea that we can communicate visibly how we're feeling, is universal. And for sure, sadness, happiness, anger, fear, disgust, surprise, and possibly even more are all universal. And what I want you to know is that you could go to any country on earth and not speak the language, and you would be able to tell, is this person angry at me? Are they sad? Like, did I just scare them? Right? Are they mad at me? This is all stuff that you are able to do. Now, you're not going to be able to get all of the cues. But the point is, if you are unable to speak a language, you are still able to emotionally express, emote, and, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm friendly, right? Things like that. Right? And part of that comes to how we read facial expressions. And if you've noticed, for the last couple years, there's been some difficulty in that, right? So you can imagine which of these is a real smile, the left or the right. Well, if you look closely, you're able to tell that it's the, what is this? The right smile, I guess, if you're looking at the screen. Why? It's in the eyes. But if you put on glasses, you completely lose that. And then you can think about what happened during the pandemic where, it's just impossible to read people's emotions completely. It's important to note that we can read people's emotions just through even their eyes. And though the pandemic happened, it did not stop our abilities to understand each other, right? That's how valuable this is. Now, we are really good at this because we get a lot of experience throughout life. And you'll notice that your emotional expressions aren't always pure. It's not always just happy or just sad, right? You'd argue that this man probably has some anger and disgust based on his face. And she's definitely surprised, and I'd argue pretty happy. It's not something that she's scared of, right? And so you can kind of learn this by just culturally gaining this information, spending time in the world, right? My daughter was born during the pandemic, so I always wondered if this would affect her, but it turns out no. She's still able to read facial expressions. So while we do have these universal expressions, everybody experiences some emotions. I will note that certain cultures focus on specific emotions. If you ask me, I would argue that the American focal emotion is happiness. It's the we have the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We want to, always be happy. It seems to be a very American thing. This also is related to affect valuation theory. Why do we have the focal motion of happiness? Well, because it seems that Americans value happiness as an important part of our lives. And so culturally, we have decided that feeling, happy is important to us. And it's something that we should all try to do. Other cultures might have different emotions. But this also relates to this idea of display rules. So what happens if your culture doesn't necessarily want you to do something? Or, you think about you don't want to laugh at a funeral, right? We might change the way we see things. One thing we can do is intensify our emotions. Think of how they're bigger, an avocado, thanks. Or we could mask our emotions, right? And make them less severe, right? Thinking about if you're playing a game of poker where you don't want somebody else to know what your hand is. You don't want to go, right? You want to keep that to yourself. So culture affects the way we express things, and gender changes the way we express things. When I ask this question, which gender experiences most emotions? I think people's native reaction is to say women experience more emotion. And that is false. It turns out that men and women experience emotions about the same. Maybe men even experience those emotions slightly more intensely than women, but they don't show them. Women express those emotions more, but they don't experience them anymore. Expression doesn't equal experience here. Why is this the case? Well, that is a whole thing, right? One reason could be that men are taught to mask their emotions, especially in US cultures, at least in this day and age. Part of this comes to what we call the precarious manhood hypothesis. So this is the idea that for men, masculinity is not something you gain and keep, right? Like when you think, apologies, I hope this doesn't sound weird, but like when a mom has a baby, she is considered like more of a woman or whatever in some people's minds. But for men, right, men can just be made fun of, and all of a sudden that being the big tough guy goes away, right? And so that we have to continuously prove that we're masculine to each other. And so that might lead to certain things like this desire to show that I am masculine, that, oh, I should always want to have sex, or I should always want to get into a fight. And right, this actually leads to a really interesting thing, that men will share their emotions with their dogs, but not with themselves or with each other or their significant others. So usually what I do in class is show the trailer for this video called The Mask You Live In. I'm going to put this up here just as something in case you're interested. This is a short video about toxic masculinity and how, right, this precarious manhood hypothesis and toxic masculinity are not healthy for men who should be expressing their emotions. And so I always kind of thank heavens that my daughter is a daughter, because I always ask my classes, if I had a boy, how would I manage to raise them to express their emotions healthily and not get bullied in middle school? Good luck. So we can also talk about the subjective experience of moods, right? So how we label an emotion. And this is going to come up here in a minute in more detail, but right, this goes back to emotional appraisals. Right? You can see this guy and say, oh, how does he feel? Most people say angry, but maybe he's actually just excited. So, right, we can acknowledge that the way we feel an emotion might be different for us than somebody else. All right, let's knock out our 3 theories on emotions, because this is an interesting question. So let's start off with the kind of the basics. Imagine that you are walking down a path and you see a snake. Now, all of a sudden, you feel afraid and are shaking. That's emotions, right? We know how this happens. Why does this happen? Well, there's 3 different theories on how this works. We're going to have to know them all. So the first theory is the James Lange theory of emotion. So William James, and I believe it's Alfred Lang, came up with this theory, and they argued that what happens is when you see something, you are sending information to your body first and then your brain, right? So you see a snake, you start to shake, and then you feel afraid, right? And so that is what is going to happen, is your body is going to cause this first. The Cannon-Bard theory argues that this is happening at the same time. You see that snake, and as your body starts to ramp up your parasympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response, your brain is going to say, that's scary, feel fear. So it's happening at the same time. And compare that to the 2-factor theory of emotion, or you might also hear this called the misattribution theory of emotion. It is the idea that it's not just our body, but it's our mental appraisals, the way we perceive this, the cognitive labeling of this, right? So this one makes a lot of sense when we think about this on a roller coaster, right? My heart is pounding, I'm sweating, but I'm saying this is fun, might change my emotion here. So let's break down these 3 here, and I've got a nice little mnemonic for the first 2. So the James Lange theory of emotion argues that, right, you see this snake or dog or whatever it is, and you feel the bodily functions first, then you feel fear. My mnemonic for this is, if you read James and Lange, A comes before E. Arousal, the cause of this, right? My body's function comes before my emotion. AE there. Unless you can think of 2 words for J and L, of which you can, please email me so I can have a better mnemonic. So the James Lange theory of emotion says that I see the object that scares me. My body says, you're scared. My brain says, hey, I noticed that you're feeling scared. You must be scared. It's one theory. The other theory, or the second theory, I should say, the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion, is that these are happening at the same time. So as our thalamus is receiving that sensory info here, right, it is going to send it in 2 places, up and down. It's going to send it to the cortex. It's going to say, hey, you're feeling afraid. And then it's also going to say, so do something about that in your body. How I like to remember the Cannon-Bard, CB, causes both, right? Or you can also think of it, right? The Cannon-Bard affects the cortex and the body, the parasympathetic nervous system. I'm trying, man. I'm trying. I'm sorry they're not the best, but you come up with a better one, you tell me. The final theory is the two-factor theory of emotion. So it is the idea that it's not only our physiological state, but it is our cognitive attribution, our cognitive label here. And so this explains what we would call the misattribution of arousal. So there's certain times, a fun study we'll talk about here, where you might mix up the way that you feel about somebody with a fear. So a really cool study looking at this was looking at if we could make people think that their scaredness was actually from attraction. And so this is the Rickety Bridge study. And basically what happens is we have an attractive woman ask men to fill out a study on either a rickety bridge, after walking across a rickety bridge, which makes people a little scared, or a regular bridge. So these people come and complete a survey with an attractive looking men, I should say. And then at the end, the woman said, hey, thanks for taking the survey. Here's my phone number if you have any questions. If you want any more detail on it, let me know. What we did was we measured how many men called in each condition. And so what we found is that on the rickety bridge condition, men were already feeling that emotional arousal, right? They had felt that kind of, I'm afraid, my heart is beating, I'm sweating a little bit. What other things make you feel like that? Talking to somebody who's very pretty, maybe? So how did they perceive that? They perceived the rickety bridge as not just the cause of why they were afraid, they perceived the woman as the cause of why they were, feeling butterflies in their stomach. On the other hand, on the rickety bridge, they didn't find her, as the cause of this emotional experience, this arousal. And so what happens is half of the men call after they've walked across the bridge, this being related to, oh, maybe we had something because I felt really, anxious when I was talking to you. Maybe it's because I think you're really attractive. Only 2 out of 16 call in the other condition, right? Suggesting that they are misattributing the fear of the bridge to finding this woman attractive versus misattributing the non-fear to nothing. And so that kind of explains that two-factor theory of emotions. But again, we've got these 3 different theories, and you should be able to explain all of them for the exam. Finally, we're going to talk about happiness, specifically because I went through my entire schooling career and nobody ever taught me how to be happy, and I think that's something we should probably do. So what does it mean to be happy? Well, if I knew, things would be different. Well, we can think about certain components of happiness, and we have 2 major components that satisfy what it takes to be happy. First is your satisfaction with your life. So, how satisfied are you? And the second one is your emotional well-being. Notice that neither of those 2 things are external. Both of those 2 things come from internal reasons. They are just from you. I like to think about the psychologist Viktor Frankl, who was in Auschwitz. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, in which he talks about the fact that certain men, even in Auschwitz, would give away their last piece of bread and were still not happy, but, were accepting of their fact. And, even in this very terrible situation, people could still find ways to find some happiness. And so that makes me ask a question. Do you think you're good at predicting how you'll feel in the future? You're not. I'll tell you that. This is the idea of affective forecasting, emotional forecasting, just like we forecast the weather. What are we going to feel tomorrow? Well, on a scale from 1 to 10, I always ask people, how happy are you today? Let's just say you're a 5. Now, how happy do you think you'll be in a year? Who knows? Do you think you'd be happier tomorrow if you won the lottery than today? I think so. If you do, my advice to you is shut up and hire a big law firm. Don't say anything to anybody. Turns out, though, a year from now, if you won the lottery tomorrow, chances are you wouldn't be much happier than you are today. What if you lost your arm or a leg tomorrow? You'd probably be pretty bad. How would you feel a year from now? You feel pretty much the same as you do now, today, not after you lost your arm. This is called the hedonic treadmill. The idea is that we will return to baseline happiness over time. And there's some genetic component to happiness, it seems to be. At least about 50% seems to be somewhat genetically affected. But you'll notice, over half of that is determined by our circumstances and our internal state of mind. So recognizing that. In terms of what makes us happy, I'm a social psychologist, so I'm biased to say this, but it truly is social connections. Feeling connected to one another makes us happy. Romantic relationships, friends, families, even a community, right? Stetson as a community or whatever university you're at might work as one. Does money? Yeah, it does, let's be honest. But only to a certain point, and it's probably around $80,000 to $85,000 nowadays. Why? Why would money stop making us happy after, $85,000? Well, it turns out that it seems that people just get more life satisfaction once this happens. And if you'll notice this other graph, while your positive emotions continue to go up, it seems that negative emotions go down once you hit this much. My argument here is that once you've made about, let's say $85,000 per person per house, if you're, without kids, you now have enough money to live comfortably, right? You are not worried about Maslow's hierarchy of needs safety, right? You are able to get what you want, right? And so you are able to have more positive and less negative feelings here. In terms of how we can be happier, though, honestly, one of the best ways is to be grateful for things. Think about what you have, not what you want. Appreciating the things that are already in your life, right? It's important to note that gratitude is going to be one of the best ways to predict how happy you are, thinking, hey, at least I have these things. The final thing I like to say is that if you are going to spend money to be happy, buy an experience. Go somewhere and do something fun. We habituate over time to goods, right? Versus experiences, which over time appreciate. They get better over time. If you buy the new iPhone tomorrow, right? Cool, that's great. But 10 days later, it's just a phone, right? It's not super exciting anymore. But if you spent that money going on a trip with you and your friends to, a water park or, to go visit somewhere beautiful, that's going to be something you'll remember for the rest of your lives. And that's going to help you to experience joy. Not only that, I always tell people experiences of awe, beautiful things that they can see, that is going to allow us to kind of feel more happy. But so my suggestion for you all is to be happy is, be grateful for what you have. Think about the satisfactions that you have in your life and think about how you can be emotionally a little bit more well. But all of that is to say that I still need to do plenty of that for myself. Anyways, I hope you all got a lot out of this lecture. I think it covers a lot and helps us to understand what it means to be a human with emotions a little bit. But if there are any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I hope you're all well, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.